Today I'm going to be talking about Chapter 15, which is over polioviruses. I'm going to have this split into two videos. In the first video, I will talk about some of the history of poliovirus and outbreaks, focusing on some of the epidemics in the U.S. We'll talk about the clinical course of infection, and then in the second video, we'll go through replication cycle and worldwide eradication efforts. So I'm sure you've heard of polio. Can cause poliomyelitis, which is the clinical condition. And if you've heard of polio, you're probably familiar with the fact that it can cause paralysis in some small percentage of infected, in which case that's called paralytic poliomyelitis. And it was particularly difficult because it was mostly children being infected and paralyzed, although the vast majority, 70+% of infections were entirely asymptomatic, so you wouldn't even know you were infected. But when you have very large numbers of individuals catching the virus, those cases of paralysis add up. And in fact, today, even though polio is mostly eradicated around the world, we'll get into that at the end of the chapter, there's still tens of millions of people living with some form of polio-induced paralysis. And we know polio's been around for a very long time. You can see Egyptian tablet here dated to about 1500 BC that shows an individual with this characteristic drop foot deformity, they call it, related to polio infection. And you can see they're walking with the help of a staff here. So for sure it's been around for thousands of years, undoubtedly longer. And in terms of more quote-unquote modern medicine, it was first documented by an English physician in the late 1700s. But I think things started to ramp up kind of in the late 1800s in Europe and in the United States, and then continued into the basically first half of the 20th century. So 1841, you had about 10 cases of infantile paralysis in Louisiana. Jump ahead to the 1890s, you have a little bit larger outbreak with 18 deaths, 132 cases of paralysis reported in the United States. Early 1900s, just in New York City, you had a big outbreak causing 125 deaths. And we'll get into what was going on in the late 40s, early 50s in a minute. But it's a little counterintuitive because we think growth and urbanization and increasing levels of hygiene, which are usually associated with reduced infection and reduced severity of infection, maybe actually played into part of the problem here. And the reason they think this is because the improved sanitation is reducing exposure, which is in turn delaying the age at which people are catching poliovirus. And we know basically the older you are when you're infected, the more likely it is that you're going to get some of the more severe central nervous system infection and possible paralysis. And also just have a larger population that's susceptible at one time. So, because polio is very widespread, most infants would have been getting antibody through breast milk, but of course then when they stop breastfeeding, they're not getting that antibody anymore, and you have this gap where people are susceptible. So still marching through our timeline here, early 1900s, you have again a really big outbreak in New York City, 9,000 cases of paralytic polio, over 2,000 deaths, and this year you had over 6,000 deaths across the country. And this basically was the trend year after year, so thousands of people dying, thousands of kids being paralyzed every year. And it really did create a bit of a panic, seemed to be most cases in the summer months. think that was just due to exposure to virus in swimming pools or other areas that people were gathering, movie theaters, etc. So a lot of those places were just being closed to try to reduce spread of the virus. So they knew polio was a viral disease, but they did not know at this time how it was being transmitted. And I think the fact that, as I mentioned, 70+% of infected individuals weren't completely asymptomatic made it more challenging, because widespread transmission, but not apparent in most of those cases. So like I said, we went on into the late 1940s, year after year, lots of cases of polio, until kind of the big breakthrough was 1949. You had these three researchers that came up with a way to grow poliovirus in human embryonic tissue cell culture in the lab, right, which would facilitate the production of a vaccine. So those three guys received the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1954 for that work. And then, of course, 1951, you have Jonas Salk, famously, University of Pittsburgh, the other Pittsburgh, using the cell culture technique to grow the virus in monkey kidney cells, and then using that to create a vaccine. So, at this time, again, you had about 20,000 cases of paralytic polio every year. And there were known to be 3 different subtypes or serotypes of poliovirus, and Salk and his research group propagated one strain of each serotype to include in the vaccine. And also at that time, it was most common to use live attenuated virus as vaccine, but he decided to use inactivated poliovirus. So he's basically inactivating using a chemical formalin. And there was some criticism to that, in particular from this guy, Albert Sabin, who we'll talk about in a minute, but ended up developing the live attenuated version of the poliovirus vaccine. But the main concern was, well, if you're using inactivated virus, it's going to be less immunogenic, not going to be as effective. But this story is very, very well known, very famous. You, of course, had the March of Dimes, right, that was really created as a fundraiser to help empower this research and vaccination effort. And so in 1954, you had the first trial. It included 1.5 million kids around the country, and they showed that, the Salk vaccine was 80 to 90% effective in preventing polio, And then the next year, that inactivated polio vaccine, or IPV for short, was approved, and it's just the classic intramuscular shot that you think of with like a flu shot or a COVID shot. I mentioned Albert Sabin, who was critical of the inactivated virus being used as the basis of the vaccine. So he had, I guess this would be about 9 years later, created his own oral polio vaccine, it was called, that was live attenuated virus. And the big advantage of this is it should, in theory, be more immunogenic, but also you could just put the virus on something like a sugar cube or a banana slice and very easily distribute doses that way. So both vaccines are out there at this point. They both cover all 3 serotypes, all 3 strains, and clinical trials are showing they're both very effective at creating immunity, especially after multiple doses. So simply due to the fact that it was easier to use and cheaper to distribute, the oral poliovirus pretty much replaced Salk's vaccine. and really became key in eliminating polio from the United States and many other countries for that matter, over the course second half of the 1900s. So one catch to mention, this is going to come back when we talk about some of the eradication efforts at the end of the chapter, that live attenuated oral poliovirus vaccine will revert back at a very low frequency to a neurovirulent strain, which could cause paralysis. So you can get what's called vaccine-derived poliovirus that can cause vaccine-associated paralytic polio. It's basically indistinguishable from, normal wild paralytic polio, but this is exceedingly rare. So one person for every 2.5 basically million doses of vaccine. But as we'll get into, we actually got to the point where there were so few cases of wild polio out there that you were actually more likely to get polio from the vaccine than you were from catching it in the wild. So they basically switched back in the turn of the century, 2000, 2001, back to the inactivated poliovirus, which cannot revert the original Salk vaccine. All right, so just to reiterate, vaccines work, right? 1957, just a couple of years after Salk's IPV was approved, right? You had case numbers plummeting, as you can see from the graph here. Last indigenous case in the U.S. in 1979. So let's talk clinical course of infection here. Again, we have these 3 serotypes. These are enteroviruses in the family Picornaviridae, and all 3 of the serotypes, 1, 2, and 3, can cause paralytic polio. For whatever reason, type 1 seems to be most involved in epidemics, at least in the U.S., but they all seem to be about equivalent. And another thing worth noting, humans are the only reservoir of poliovirus, which just means in terms of eradication efforts, you don't have to worry about there being polio out there in other animal populations that could then be spread back to humans. In terms of its transmission, the main mode of transmission is fecal-oral route. So we'll see viruses shed in feces at very high levels. This is a very tough virus, so even though it's not enveloped, it's resistant to acids, detergents. You need a high percentage of alcohol or bleach or very high heat to destroy the virions. So that's not great, right? It's stable out in the environment or in fresh or seawater for extended periods of time. So just means you're more likely to encounter it in the wild, even if somebody who's infectious hasn't been in that locale for a while. So I mentioned fecal-oral as the primary route of transmission, but I think can also be passage through saliva. So they've recovered it in throat swabs, and that would mean, of course, kissing, sharing utensils or cups could potentially spread the virus as well. So if you are infected with polio, you're going to be infectious, be contagious anywhere from 10 days before your first symptoms to 10 days after symptoms disappear. And we know virus is being shed in the stool for weeks and weeks, even after symptoms are gone. And given what we just talked about in terms of modes of transmission, may not be surprising to learn that the virus replicates initially in cells in the oropharynx or in the mucosal cells lining the gastrointestinal tract. And then from those sites, going to get into either tonsils in the mouth or these lymph nodes called the Peyer's patches in the small intestine. from there into the bloodstream, and you'll get a first and usually minor viremia. Again, that's just the term for virus spreading through the bloodstream. And as we'll see in some cases, then you can get a second viremia, a major viremia that will actually transmit things to the central nervous system. But as we discussed, right, the vast majority of cases inapparent, no symptoms at all. About a quarter of all cases are abortive, meaning you get some mild symptoms like headache, fever, maybe a bit of a sore throat, but then it's just going to completely resolve. So you probably wouldn't even think you'd had polio. And as I mentioned, you get that minor viremia, and if other sites are infected during that virus spread through the bloodstream, so commonly things like bone marrow, muscle, spleen, other distant lymph nodes, that can lead to that second major viremia down the road, and this is where you'll start to get virus into the peripheral nerves, going back into the central nervous system via retrograde transport. And then this is where we start getting the risk of paralysis. So if virus is in the central nervous system, we have two forms of disease: non-paralytic meningitis or the paralytic poliomyelitis. Anywhere from 1 to 5% of cases are going to be the non-paralytic meningitis, which can obviously still be serious, right? You've got virus in your brain and spinal cord. That's going to cause some serious symptoms. Can cause some nerve damage in some cases, but in most individuals, that's going to resolve completely on its own. And then less than 1% of cases are going to be paralytic, which is obviously the worst case scenario. And those symptoms of paralysis could start anywhere from a day to, almost 3 weeks after you get those initial non-specific prodromal symptoms. And it's usually described as a flaccid paralysis, just like a weakness in the muscles, lack of normal reflexes, and that, of course, is happening because motor neurons are being destroyed. The paralysis is almost always asymmetrical, so affecting, one side of the body more than others, typically affecting legs more than arms. And then once you've got some nerve death or damage, then that can lead to muscle atrophy and more prolonged issues. So within that paralytic poliomyelitis, there are 3 different types. There's spinal, bulbar, and bulbospinal. None of these are great. The spinal is kind of the classic where you're affecting motor neurons, and this is from virus getting into these anterior horn cells there. And this is the majority of the paralytic cases are going to be spinal poliomyelitis. In the bulbar, the virus is getting into and damaging cells in the bulbar region of the brainstem. That's the part that controls things like swallowing and breathing. So not good at all, right? Luckily, that's a very low % of those paralytic cases. And then bulbospinal is affecting both regions there. And so if you have that bulbar region damaged so that your breathing is affected, this is where things like the iron lung, which was, primitive artificial respirator that was invented specifically for paralytic polio cases, you had people that were having to spend either all their time or, a large portion of their time in these devices to assist in their breathing. And there's you don't see many of these out there today, but I did read an article just earlier this year or late last year. There was a guy in Texas that had just passed away at some ripe old age, but he had still been spending a good chunk of his day in an iron lung from some paralytic polio symptoms that he had. Then I also wanted to mention something called post-polio syndrome. So out of those people who had some form of paralytic polio, anywhere from 1/4 to 40% of those individuals will develop post-polio syndrome years down the road, could be as many as 40 years down the road. So in this situation, it's not a reinfection, but the idea is you basically had some damage to specific muscles during the initial infection, and that's kind of led to this like slow, gradual atrophy and fatigue over the years that can then damage neurons that are trying to overcompensate, and you start getting some basically after the fact paralysis popping up. So that's got to be discouraging for sure if you already lived through this traumatic event and think you're recovered and moving on with your life, and then boom, all of a sudden it's back causing you problems again. So usually this is going to be more motor neuron, muscle paralysis type issues. Occasionally you'll get into the bulbar tissues and some of those autonomic reflexes being affected. So I will stop here and we'll pick this up in second video.